All right, guys, we're just going to wait for the live to start, trickle in, but feel free to drop your questions. Otherwise, just use it as a working kind of hour, which is what I'm hoping to do, but hopefully also answer some of your questions as we go through this. Hopefully you guys are having a great day. All right, guys, hopefully you guys are having a great day. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop it in the comment section. I'm just going to be using this as kind of like a work time / just interact with you guys. So feel free to drop it in the chat if you have any questions. Otherwise, listen in. I'm sure people will trickle in over time. If you're studying on this beautiful Sunday, I hope you wish you were doing something else. But let me know if there's any way I can help you guys on your medical journey. I'd be happy to do so. How should you start pharmacology? Okay. So pharmacology is definitely like a very fact heavy class. And so I definitely recommend using like flashcards or something to just help you with the repetition. So if you are somebody who likes to learn the big picture, then like resources like Picmonic or Sketchy Farm are great because they kind of put together all of the topics into one area, into one short video. So that's a good way to like start to get the broad overview. And then using flashcards is something that way you can say, oh, I remember that. Let me just make sure it's a constant repetition. So you don't have to go too crazy, and I recommend you don't because farm requires lots of repetition. So for you to get the best bang for your buck, find a resource that can teach you all of the kind of the forest from the trees kind of resource, either that book or a video resource, and then use flashcards. Lang Pharmacology has great flashcards. People make very Anki flashcards. You can make your own if you'd like. And doing those. And those two combinations ideally will help you get the big picture details as well as just the ability to review and remember over time. So that's how I would do it. You also get better at it over time as you actually start using the medications or seeing which medications are used more frequently. So it is a little bit of an experience over time, but that just means repetition is truly key when it comes to farm. Hopefully that helped. If you're just joining in, like I said, just feel free to drop your questions. I'm going to be using this as a work hour to just get some done, sending emails. But if there's anything I can help you guys at all on your medical journey, regardless of how small or big it is, or if you just want to say hi and give a thumbs up, I'm cool with that as well. But hopefully you guys are having a good Sunday. This is actually a Mio drink, in case you haven't had them. They're great for like vitamins, caffeine. So it supplements my daily coffee. They also really taste good. In the meantime, what I will do is yesterday, at least if you're on my email list at all, I do usually send questions of what kind of things you guys want to see. So feel free to drop your questions, but I'm going to go ahead and find those questions and then I'll answer them in case you're watching and one of those questions is yours. Let's see. I also realized that I sent all of those answers to that survey link that I sent yesterday on my emails to my wife's account. So I'm having to log into her email to read your questions for the TheMDJourney. But feel free to drop your questions. But some of the questions that I got yesterday, one of them was about how to find research opportunities in med school, especially at schools that are not research heavy. The thing that I would say there is that you're not tied to the med school that you're doing research on, especially with COVID. A lot of things are remote, which is beautiful because you can work on projects that people are wanting to, but because of COVID, they just don't have the influx of people asking to do research. So reach out to nearby institutions that are really research heavy. There's a lot of projects that you guys can do that are just on your computer. That's pretty much all of the projects that I was working on. So case studies, retrospective studies, we're just like reviewing data and charts. And so reach out to people, and you don't have to be at the same institution, say medical school. Research is research regardless of where you are. You may have to do a bunch of credentialing stuff, but if you don't have opportunities at your school, obviously look a little bit harder just in case. But you can definitely reach out to other institutions all across really the country. So those would be the things there. There you go, pessimist. Are there any resources like Sketchy for learning muscle innervations functions, but having a hard time learning musculoskeletal anatomy? I have to double think. I think the main resource that I really enjoy using for anatomy itself is Anatomy Zone. It's like a 3D kind of YouTube compilation of where things are in relation to each other. And they also they have a video about the muscles. They have the videos about the nerves and the veins. Have the videos, about organs and systems and how they're structured. So I definitely recommend checking those out. And that's usually kind of my go-to resource when I was learning an anatomy. I think, I'm not sure if first aid really includes a lot of the functions, but I don't think that they do. But I would try Anatomy Zone out. And if I have a chance in this video, I'll go ahead and look up something else, because I know one of my coaching students was using a resource that they really enjoyed, but it's not off the top of my head, but try Anatomy Zone in case that helps you guys out. All right. Next question was somebody was concerned about not working fast enough and taking too long on their lectures. I think that's a problem for probably all of us, where you're studying and you feel like you're just overloaded with the amount of information you learn, but for some reason you're taking too much time to do it. The first thing I would tell you to do is to really use a timer of some sense. So for example, if you're studying 10 hours a day, ask yourself what you would do differently if you had to study 8. You don't have to go about doing it, but it really forces yourself to say, okay, what am I doing that I wouldn't do? Like if the test was suddenly surprisingly tomorrow, how would I change things? And that really forces you to say, well, if I have a 60-minute lecture and it's taking me 2 hours to study, how would I do it if I only had an hour? And it forces you to, one, become more efficient, one, being okay with not knowing everything, because that's usually what slows us down. And two, also just tells you like these techniques I'm using, but they're not the most effective and time, conducive. And I should be doing more of my time here. So If you feel like you're not studying fast enough, ask yourself what's really slowing you down. And one of the best ways to do it is just act like a professor told you, test this tomorrow. Holy crap, what would I do? Other questions, I'll be taking step 1 in July. Wondering if you start UWorld ASAP or do another question bank first, and save your full dedicated. So July, you got about 3 to 4 months left. So I would pick the latter. Using UWorld for dedicated is really nice because then you get to test yourself on things that are the most similar to step 1 related questions. So USMLE-RX is a good one. People use Kaplan. People use things from Boards and Beyond. So definitely get those practice questions in, but you just don't want to be in a situation where you're prepping for your dedicated and you're getting questions right because you remember what the right answer is and not necessarily what the right concept is. So if you really want to do well on step 1, the concepts are the most important. So I'd recommend using a different question bank and then using UWorld for your dedicated. Renee is asking, what's the best way to learn or understand information? So this will really depend on you, Renee. I mean, obviously, all of us learn differently. But what I would say is, kind of like what I was saying about five minutes ago, is ask yourself, if the test was tomorrow, what would you do? If suddenly if your professor said test is no longer in 4 weeks, it's tomorrow, how would you study differently? What techniques would you immediately go to, and then what techniques would you go away from? That already tells you a spectrum of how you learn best. And so my answer to that question will be completely different to yours, but definitely using a more active kind of thing. So I love flashcards. Not everyone does. I love having a blank piece of paper or a notebook where I just say, I'm going to recreate the lecture that I just had from memory and seeing how well I do, and then identifying those gaps that I don't know how to go from point A to point B. That's a great way of saying, I thought I learned it, and here is a good visual representation that here are some of my weak points. I need to go back and review them. Some people enjoy group studying, practice questions, but ask yourself that question of what you would do if time was very limited. That's your best way of learning and understanding information. And then combining that with some kind of repetition. So don't just learn something, don't just read something and then say, I'm good, I'm going to move on to the next lecture. No, instead ask yourself, what system do I have to actively learn something? And then what system do I have to come back to the things that I'm really weak at? So I use, Anki is a very natural way of reviewing things. People have used my Excel method that I talk about on YouTube. But you just have to have a way that you learn best, and then a way that you can come back to the things that you don't learn best. So hopefully that helps. All right. IMG, current COVID situation. How can I go for my electives and clerkships in the US, especially being international grads and needing recommendations? So I'm unfortunately not too inclined to be able to answer that question just because, one, I'm not doing it. And so I don't know what situations are currently open. The good thing is with the current COVID situation improving, at least here in the United States, with regulations, in my opinion, going to slowly being lifted, just because more and more people being vaccinated. I'm hoping that the situation becomes a little bit easier, but I would just continue to broaden out and reach out, especially in the states where you see those regulations really start to improve, and seeing if you can get those clerkships, especially for the upcoming months in June, July, or in states like Texas, where I'm living in. Our state government's already done a very fast job of opening up the state. And so with the vaccines rolling out, I think you're going to have more ability to do those clerkships. All right. Sanib, you are starting school this year. What do students often look when starting med school? Ooh, you're about to get me started. I love these questions. I think the thing that people overlook is that there is a definition of what you think med school will look like. And everyone will kind of have the same kind of picture, is that med school needs to be this busy and needs to spend this many hours. And I need to be this happy, which usually is low. And I need to make these sacrifices. And you continue to perpetuate that, and then your grades don't obviously look like the way you want to, just because med school is different. And so you won't get the grades you want. And then you kind of go into this deadly cycle of I need to spend more hours, need to make more sacrifices, and I need to be more unhappy. But if you go in the mindset of saying, I am not going to commit to that. Instead, I'm going to say, I am going to enjoy myself. I'm going to enjoy my fitness. If that's important to me, I'm going to enjoy the people I love. I'm going to continue to do the things that I love, hobbies, and I'm still going to get better at my studying over time. Then you are in this mindset of these 4 years are going to be fun. I'm going to enjoy them. I'm going to work hard, but I'm going to enjoy it. And people don't go in with that mindset. People usually say, I'm going to let med school allow me to make the sacrifices I need to get wherever I want to be. But you can still be happy. You can still do well, as long as you go with an impression that I need to go in with a mindset that my life still shouldn't be on the back burner just because I need to go through 4 years in med school. So go in with the mindset of, I still want to be able to enjoy myself, and I'm going to make those things still a priority. I mean, I make tons of videos on YouTube about how to do that, but go with the mindset that you deserve to be happy all 4 years. You don't need to make your happiness a form of sacrifice. So hopefully that makes sense. What's the best way to stand out for residency applications, especially with STEP becoming pass-fail? To be quite honest, I'm kind of glad that step 1 is pass-fail. I know it affects a lot of people in international wise, but one that forces you to study more for step 2 CK, which I think is definitely more correlative of what kind of doctor and knowledge base you have. So in terms of once you start getting into your clerkships, I'm not sure how far you are from residency applications based off your question, but as you get closer to applying for residency. So while you're in your clinical rotations, I recommend definitely doing a lot of step 1 or step 2 questions, So through UWorld, and obviously as you're studying for your boards and your shelf exams, make sure that your knowledge is always growing. So that way step 2 isn't like a worrisome thing. It's just a very natural thing you've been doing in the background, and then you do well on exam. In terms of how to stand out otherwise, besides just the grades, have some kind of story or journey that's progressed to the ultimate specialty you picked. All of us don't necessarily have, I want to do this, and thus, in 5 years, it's going to be very obvious that all my experiences have led to it. A lot of us will have deviations of saying, I thought I wanted to do these fields, and then suddenly this came out of the blue at the very end, but I really want to do anesthesiology, where initially I thought I was going to be a surgeon. Just paint that story nicely. Like, what experience have you done that pointed you to something, away from something, and now ultimately to whatever experience you're going to do? Then you have a residency application that ideally is good on the number sense, ideally is good from your evaluation sense, because you worked hard on your rotations, you worked hard on your shelves, but most importantly, whatever story you're trying to sell of why you want to become a general surgeon, anesthesiologist, internal medicine, it makes sense. And really, that's the best way to stand out, because a lot of people just sound very cookie cutter. They've done the same experiences, they've taken the same test as you, but their story is where you can really make yourself different. So obviously do well on the test, so that way you can get your eyeballs on your application, but then tell the story of how you got there. Let's see. Do you think it's possible to study for step 1 in 6 months? I want to give my exam in December. Absolutely. I'm assuming that, you're potentially IMG and wanting to test, but 6 months I think is more than enough, especially if you start to do the background knowledge now, possibly even, watching all those heavy content things. So if you're going to use Pathoma, if you're going to use Sketchy, those things are really time intensive. And the latter parts of your studying, I'd recommend more just doing as many questions as possible and trying to improve your knowledge base and your weakness. So if you have 6 months, I would spend the first 2 just trying to get through all of Sketchy, getting all of Pathoma or whatever the time frame may be, and using the latter part to really get honed in on doing as many practice questions as you do. And then the one part that really affects people who get great step 1 scores and people who get average scores, people who don't, is having a nice system of saying, every time you miss a question, here is how I plan on reviewing that for the future. That way it's no longer a weakness on the real thing. But 6 months, absolutely. Hamas said, who USMLE or PLAB? I honestly don't know what PLAB is, so you may have to inform me a little bit, but so I can't answer that question, unfortunately. But USMLE I'm aware of, so let me know what that means. If somebody else can help, Muhammad, that'd be great. Renee, could you link your videos for the Excel method? Absolutely. I will try to put it in, but I think if you click on my study playlist here on YouTube, you'll probably be able to find it. And if not, I will link it, or you can send me a message on Instagram. Hopefully I can find it too. Yeah, awesome questions so far. Keep dropping them, and I'm going to continue to look through the chat to see what else we got. All right, 4th-year medical student, currently studying balancing rotations with my online classes. Do you have advice on how I can ensure not to fall behind? So actually, that's an interesting question, just because I'm not used to the 4th-year med school being associated with online classes, but I'm assuming where your institution is, that's natural. So I may obviously need a little bit of background information, so I'm making some assumptions here. But I would essentially ask yourself how you can get the most efficient, particularly with the online classes. Usually with the rotations at the hospitals, your hours are kind of picked for you. You know, what time you have to show up, what time you leave. And so step 1 would be with your online classes, ask how you could get the most efficient with your studying. Again, kind of like we talked about earlier, if the test was tomorrow, what would be the 1 or 2 things you would do, and then remove the rest. So you're going to have to really get super efficient and super narrow in terms of your study approach. And then ideally with your rotations, if the whole hour, if you're there from 6 in the morning to 5 p.m. In the evenings, then ask yourself if there are any lull times in between those where you can study for your online classes or study for rotations. That when you come home, again, you can get into that really focused mindset of preparing for your classes. So if you're starting to notice that you're falling behind, ask yourself what you're doing from step 1 to feeling super comfortable for the exam, and find what kind of techniques you're doing in terms of retention, long-term retention for that material that may be forcing you to fall behind. So just a good example would be like usually when you're studying for rotations here in the US, you're also studying for like step 2. And people are like, well, how do I do the 2? And usually my answer is you need to make step 2 as natural and as efficient as possible. So just get straight to the practice questions. Quit reading the books. Just get to the practice questions. That way you can just quickly visually see, I suck at this, I'm great at this, and without like getting further behind. So hopefully that helps. All right, medical science, cool name. IMG here, 6 months from STEP. All right, currently doing boards and beyond. Very low scores on UWorld, and I'm not able to do Anki because my classes. How can I improve and retain the info? Like I said, I think the biggest kind of issue with step 1 is when you get low scores on UWorld, that's not a point of failure. I think honestly, when I was taking UWorld, I would get tests where I'd do like 35 to 45%, and my final step score didn't reflect that. Use that as like, wow, this is awesome. Like I've realized 50% of the knowledge that I could have missed in the actual thing. Let me now use this freaking time to create a list. So I love using the Excel method. So whoever asked about it, I can just quickly describe it, but I think it was Renee. But essentially, the Excel method is you have an Excel sheet. I love using Google spreadsheets because you get to take it with you. One column is the topics that you're missing and some kind of reference to it. So let's say you miss a question about septic shock, you can put septic shock in the column. The next thing would be like some form of quick reference where if you looked at it, you're like, oh, here is the concept that I missed. And then you can have another column that can break categories. So like if you're missing a question for infectious disease versus cardiology. And then the final thing would be kind of how difficult that question is for you. And I usually use a scale of 1 to 5. So 5s are topics that are super hard. 1s are things that are super easy. I just missed, and I just want to make sure I don't miss in the future. So initially, when you're getting low scores on UWorld, you want to just keep growing the list and then having some kind of structure to come back to it. Ideally, I recommend that like the next morning before you get into your next UWorld session, you quickly just do 30 minutes of it, not doing a certain amount of them. Just saying I'm going to spend 30 minutes doing my top difficult questions, whether it be all my 5s, all my 4s. And over time, that weakness will fall. And you'll see your UWorld questions improve because ideally you'll start being tested on similar topics. So it's not about getting low UWorld scores now. You're prepping. That's a good sign because that means that you're finding more and more weaknesses that you can work on in the short term as you get closer to test date. So don't be nervous about that. Instead, saying, how will I be using these low scores to help raise my score? I feel like sometimes we use UWorld as like an assessment of how I'll do on the real thing, but instead you will use UWorld as an opportunity of saying, here's what I would have missed if I hadn't had the opportunity to miss it now. And now ask yourself, what am I going to do to raise that final awareness? So hopefully that helps. How to know the high yield subtopics in the particular topic. One of the things that I love to talk about when it comes to knowing what's high yield and what's not is, usually we go into class and it's done with a professor who has like a very kind of focused mindset of what they want to teach you. And not all of it's high yield, as we know. And so the best way to do it, honestly, is I would use resources that are meant to be high yield from the very get-go. So I love watching YouTube videos. I'm a very video centered person, but that's just one example. So let's just say tomorrow you're going to learn about how to identify AFib on the EKGs. So instead of going into class and like realizing all of the small details and big topics that the professor is going to talk about, maybe watch 1 or 2 videos on AFib that are like 5-10 minutes on YouTube and just get an idea of what's the most important thing. Because then when you go into class and your professor talks about something, you're like, oh, I heard that in one of those videos. That's high yield, even if it's a subtopic. Versus if you watch 3 high yield videos and your professor still talks about something, that may be kind of a detailed point that you may still want to know for your class purposes, but not necessarily for high yield purposes for AFib. So hopefully that makes sense. Use a high yield resource that's very quick to consume to get a very broad understanding of what you should be expected to know. Then go into class with the understanding of saying, oh, if I hear something twice, that's a good sign that that's high yield. That's usually how I approach how to know what's high yield without doing too much effort and like reading the syllabus, because that doesn't really help either. I go pessimist. Good idea to use QBanks for boards beyond and Boston study for in-lecture exams. I learned a lot. I think doing practice questions for your like your actual classes, absolutely. If your class gives you kind of practice questions, do those first, obviously, because you want to make sure that material is high. But then, definitely, a quick example is as you start getting to second year and you're studying for step one, although it's starting to become pass fail now, it's still good to do questions that are not created by your institution, to just see how well you can identify high yield information based off what you learned about. So I'm all about doing practice questions in a structured way. Usually I recommend doing it once in the weekend where like your time commitment's not very high, or using like one day during the weekdays it's not too busy, maybe like a Wednesday. If Monday and Tuesdays are kind of busy and Wednesdays are a little bit lighter, then you can just say, I'm going to do 10 questions on this day, and then I'm going to do 20 questions on Saturday. And so nothing super committal, but they're great ways for you to test yourself. Let's see. So I think Yogesh asked a similar question about the subtopics, and then 260 beyond and why. I'm assuming you're from New York. How do you manage countertransference with your residents struggling with them? Is hypercritical in my notes, giving me feedback. So I think you just have to understand feedback for what it is. There's definitely going to be instances where your residents are going to give you feedback that you're not going to necessarily like, and you're going to feel like it was not necessarily the feedback you wanted. My first step always when you want to build this nice rapport on your rotations is understand the expectations of your attending, understand the expectations of your residents, and you'll still have manage my language a-holes for your residents who are not all about the students, and that just kind of happens. But you just want to make sure you know what their expectations are. So if their expectations are you do A, B, and C, you do those. And then you look for those subtle clues when they don't like a med student that talks a lot, or they don't like a med student that bothers them when they're super busy. There's a lot that comes into it. And that requires you to just be able to pick up on those cues. And if they give you feedback on something that seems that's very hypercritical, just take it and use it to improve versus focusing on the person itself. So if somebody gives you a very kind of specific, I want you to do A, B, and C, it may not be conducive for how you do your notes in the future. But just use it as feedback, because it'd be silly to have that affect you. But always, again, start with the framework of what would they want you to do, what their expectations are. Try to live up to those as best you can. And then ideally try not your best to kind of have this negative environment that's created between you and your residents, because then you'll be miserable the whole rotation. So it's all about progress. So use your expectations of saying, what goals do I want to reach to? And then what kind of things do I want to do myself by the end of this rotation? So being hypercritical of your notes, obviously it's a little unfortunate, but use that as the ability of saying, okay, which parts would I really take with a grain of salt, and which parts are true points of feedback that I should improve on in my future notes or my presentations. Aaron, currently studying for step one. Lots of step one questions. Finding amboss in UWorld for a second time. Loving your for a second time here in a couple of weeks. Yeah, I mean, I think that's completely fine. I think a lot of these questions today are step one related, so definitely watch the live stream again in case you joined a little bit later. But I would definitely recommend, if you're doing amboss, you're doing UWorld a few times, just having that list of questions that you're missing, and then having a good way of coming back to it, ideally daily, even if it's just 30 minutes. To really just say, these are things that I missed, I'm not going to miss them again. And you should start seeing your scores go up. Okay. Medical science. I spent too much time on UWorld, more than 6 hours on one block. Wow. Yeah. How can I review a block faster? Cool. That's a great question. I actually answered this for one of the MedElite students the other day. But the thing that I would tell you is that ask yourself, if it takes you 6 hours to review one block, that's definitely a lot of time. Would 5 hours for that block really change your final performance? You may say initially, absolutely. But if you could have used that extra hour that you would have saved to do another question blank, what's going to be more effective for you? Definitely it's going to be doing more practice questions in your sense. So if it's taking you 6 hours, you want to have to get out of the mindset, because 6 hours tells me that you're so worried about missing something, that you're so worried about missing out, and this FOMO of oh, what if this shows up on the final exam? I really need to can focus. Remember, step one prep is all about repetition. So if you give 6 hours to 40 questions, that means you're not able to give tons of hours to all the other hundreds of questions that are still left to be shown. So one, have that mental mindset that it's okay not to know everything. Have some way of saying that I'm going to do my best to track everything I'm not good at through Excel methods, Anki, whatever you want to do. And then using a personal timer. If you personally still struggle with letting go of saying it takes me 6 hours to study a block, how would I do it in 3? That's a hard challenge. Force yourself to say, I'm going to spend X amount of time per question reviewing and then moving on. So either an actual timer on your smartphone, a timer on your laptop, whatever it may be, and just work a little bit at a time. So if you're at 6 hours, do it in 5 hours. If you're at 5 hours eventually, do it in 3.5, and just keep working on it slowly. It may seem overwhelming to do, but just understand of what you're losing out on by reviewing so long. You may be getting great knowledge on that 40 questions, but there's still hundreds and thousands of questions that you still need to do this on. So you have to let go a little bit to get to that repetition, which is truly where the value lies. Did I start med school wanting to practice IM? Absolutely not. Actually, one of my peers told me early in med school that this is what I was going to do. And I told him, you're absolutely crazy. I wanted to come into medical school, did a lot of things. So I was really interested in sports. I still am, but I thought maybe I'd do orthopedic surgery. And then I realized really quickly I wasn't into surgery. So I was like, oh, maybe I can do family medicine and do a sports medicine fellowship. And it just didn't seem attractive to do for me, for my interest, to do a family medicine residency, because then I'd be doing 3 years of stuff that I didn't really want to do to eventually do a sports medicine fellowship. So that kind of fell out of water. And I thought maybe cancer and oncology would be a cool field. And so I did radiation oncology research for like 3-4 years of medical school. And I realized that future planning and where I wanted to live and geographic stuff, it didn't like necessarily fit. So then I eventually went to internal medicine and emergency medicine. And I did a sub-I in emergency medicine the start of my 4th year. And within 3 days, I was like, nope, not for me. So ultimately I picked IM. And then some parts of that, I was also interested in pediatrics because I worked with autistic kids during my gap year. And then I worked at a type 1 diabetic camp for kids as well for 2 kind of summers in med school. And so a lot of pediatric experiences, but the parents that go into working with kids was definitely super stressful. And so I said, no, thanks. And I absolutely love IM. You still get to interact with patients. You get to take care of a lot of things. You get to make diagnoses. You get to send people home, make them feel better. And still lots of career options. You have to completely decide what you want to do even to this point. So thanks for asking. You have really good insight. How do I maintain active learning from UWorld explorations? So I struggle reading the answer, especially after working 12 hours in the wards. Absolutely. So one thing that I usually will do when I'm reading explanations, and keep in mind, it's been a while since I've done like step 2 prep. I've obviously done step 3 prep recently, but that was done a little bit differently. Is when I'm reading explanations, usually I will use just the highlighting function on UWorld to just get an idea of like, what are the key things I want to take away from each answer choice. So like, there was a question about different types of shock. I'm like, oh, I just needed to remember that this shock went this way for the cardiac output. This shock went this way for the SVR, and I forgot about that in this question. So that is kind of my representation of like, what did I initially think about when I was trying to answer the question? And what is the explanation focus on? So before I read the explanation, have that mindset of like what I thought I was going to answer and how I thought I was going to answer, and then go into the mindset of like, oh, this is the things that they consider to be important. So I'd quickly just highlight those without, reading. And you get better at this over time because, again, mentally, I have a timer now that says within a minute, you need to move on to the next question, because I don't want to give this question more focus than the last question that I missed on this block, or to be able to sacrifice me doing another block. So that's essentially how I would do it. Have a framework of what you thought, use the explanations quickly as a self-correction, and then having a system, again, like we talked about a lot and so far, of like recording that on an Excel sheet or something where you're just like, okay, let me just have this quick, this is what the explanation said. These are the things that I missed. Let me just jot that down in an Excel sheet so I don't forget about it later, and then I can refer to it. So that's kind of my active way of saying, here's my current representation. Here is how I self-correct. Move on to the next thing. Having that timer also forces me to focus on the highest bits of the text without getting like too caught up in the weeds. But even myself will struggle with it. It's just the goal approach of how I would do it. Aaron says, weakness in biostats epidemiology. Any suggestions for that topic specifically? Biostats, I would, if it's for step 1, definitely a lot of the UWorld questions that come with biostats are pretty much really all you will eventually need. excuse me. And so, if you really suck with it, I would definitely recommend just having certain sessions throughout the week where you're just doing 20, 40 questions of biostat, because it's really all the same thing. It's about sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, et cetera, being able to read an ad. And there are some great YouTube videos that if you watch, people will do explanations of those questions with you live. And if you don't find enough step 1 videos, honestly, you can watch the step 3 videos because the questions are pretty much the same. For step 3, they just care more about biostats because physicians will use it for research and ability to understand journals. But watching a step 3 video of people walking you through questions about how to answer typical biostat questions is a great way to do it. But just having subjects of blocks where you're just saying, well, on Wednesday afternoon, I'm going to just do 20 questions of biostats because I suck at it and I just need more practice and repetition. Lots of step 1 questions today. I like it. Step 1, Kaplan, doctors in training. Which do you recommend? I used Kaplan when I was in medical school, and I found the topics to be a little bit harder than a real thing. I really enjoyed USMLE-RX, and I talk about it a lot here. It's a little bit easier than the other topics that you use or the other QBanks, but I definitely found that, I sucked at reading first aid, and I just wanted something that could test me on first aid. And so USMLE-RX is made by the same makers. And so it was a great way to combine that. Yeah, and I would recommend USMLE-RX if you're studying with your classes. People love Boards and Beyond and AMBOSS too. I can't comment on the latter two just because I didn't specifically use those. Physio is something that I've actually talked about on this channel because I've actually checked out their resources. So there's a video on the YouTube channel. And they've definitely grown their content too. So if you want something that has videos and practice questions and Anki decks and mnemonics, I would recommend those out as well. All right. How do you retrieve the knowledge when answering the questions? How will you identify that particular points to a particular disease or condition? So my frame approach of answering a question for step or whatever is kind of backwards, and because I just don't want to fall for the common traps that people will set up for you when they make an exam. But if you think from the viewpoint of the person who creates the exam, they essentially have the concept that they want you to understand. They're going to put the right answer in, they're going to put the right clues in, and then they're going to put traps in to match with one of the other answer choices. So if you work backwards, usually don't fall into those traps as well. And so usually I'll read the last line of the question to get an idea of what I'm going to be answering. I'll look at the answer choices to see what my options are. And then I usually read the last few lines of the paragraph too, because sometimes the question, the answer is specifically there and I don't have to catch myself on the whole vignette. So last line, answer choices, last few lines of the paragraph before I even get to the vignette. And before I get to the vignette, now if I still can't answer the question, then usually I'll say, okay, what has to be true for this to be right, for this to be right, for this to be right? And kind of thinking about what clues I should expect in the vignette to answer those specific answer choices. And now I'm actually looking for the clues versus reading the vignette and thinking, oh, maybe this is a clue, maybe it's not. So that's kind of my active way of answering questions. And to know if it's pointing to a specific disease, I just work backwards. So if the question is an infectious disease question and it has multiple different kinds of infections, and one of them is Lyme's disease, excuse me, then I may think about, okay, is it talking about somebody who's from a specific region? Does it talk about their rash? Does it talk about other symptoms that they have? Are they confused? Do they have heart block? You work backwards. So if you know a lot about the topic, you can easily work backwards and saying that clue is not there. This clue doesn't really point to it. So this answer choice is likely not right. And then again, answering as quickly as possible so you can see the explanation saying, oh, shoot, I missed this part. That's important. Next time I see this kind of question, I'll know I need to add that in. So that's my question about retrieving knowledge. I usually just work backwards to answer the question. How we analyze a question approach. I think how to prepare for the CCS cases. I'm assuming you're talking about step 3 because CS is gone. But the CCS cases for step 3 for you guys that haven't taken or kind of removed from it because lots of step 1 questions is kind of the second day of step 3. So step 3 is broken into 2 days. The first part is your typical practice questions. The second day is also some multiple choice questions, and the latter part are these simulations, but I actually found pretty fun where they give you a case and you have to order something, work up stuff, and ideally treat the patient. And so usually how to prepare for them is if you're studying for step 3 and let's say you have 6 weeks to prepare. I would spend about the first 3.5, 4 weeks really focusing on the multiple choice. So that way you can understand what you're good at, from general surgery, internal medicine, pediatrics. And then using that last part, those last 2.5 weeks to really start doing the cases. There's about 50 cases that you have to do, and then there's some other example cases. And so ideally you want us to start doing like 1 or 2 a day where you can really start getting practice with the simulation software. And similar to the practice questions of like, let's say you were doing a question and it was about like an OB-GYN related question. You're like, oh crap, I forgot to order this or I forgot to do this. Then just add that to your list of like, oh, if it's an OB-GYN related question, this should be on my mental checklist of something I should order. And that's how I prepare for it. So each case, I'm like personally just doing them, and then I'm looking to see what explanations did that I didn't do. And I'm adding that to my list of like, okay, if it's an OB-GYN question, do this. If the patient comes to the ED, make sure you order these kind of labs and these kinds of like additional things. So, but I'm glad you guys are finding this helpful. Abed, what's going on? Always on my YouTube channel. I love it. I appreciate it. If you guys are enjoying this live stream, as some of you guys have done, just hit that thumbs up button down below. It definitely helps me out. Billy Rubens says, 3rd year about to start IM rotation. That's what's up. I was wondering if you had advice on how to get better with presentations. Yeah, I think presentations, there is a long-winded answer to this. So one, I would recommend just watching some of the presentation videos that we have on YouTube here. But one, understanding what expectations your attending has, because some of them would just say, I just want you to get to the point as quickly as possible. And then that is a different presentation of somebody saying, oh, I want you to traditionally like present the H&P and the social history and the family history. So ask what the expectations are. Otherwise, you'll be presenting to what you think the expectation is. And then somebody clearly just wants a really quick, efficient presentation. So keep that in mind. And in terms of how to get better at presentations, think of every presentation as an opportunity to tell a story. So an H&P is an opportunity to say, my final diagnosis for this patient is this. Obviously in IM, they have multiple things going on, but usually they have one problem that brought them in. So if somebody comes in with abdominal pain and nausea, vomiting, you can say, my final diagnosis for this patient is I think that they have DKA from not taking their insulin. So that is your final diagnosis. And that's ultimately the punchline you want to get to. Now, everything that you tell from that point on, ideally should be a bullet point kind of structure chronologically of why you want everyone to be convinced that they have DKA and not that they have a mass or that they have like ulcerative colitis or that they just ate something bad. Think about your presentations as kind of a back front way instead of saying, this is what's going on. Here's their social history. Here's what meds they're taking. That's really boring. And if you can tell a story that's really like very convincing to your final diagnosis, you get away with including facts that people don't care about. It's okay to know the facts on your piece of paper, but not necessarily say them. So again, if I was trying to sell a story that somebody had a pulmonary embolism because they came in with chest pain, the attending is going to want to know, okay, like how long did it start? What features are they having? And why do you not think that it's a heart attack, right? So their troponins were normal when they came to the emergency room. They got an EKG, which looked fine, but they got a CT abdomen, or they got a CT of their chest, which is concerning for a clot. So my final diagnosis is a PE. So if you work backwards, all the stories that you tell will be very easy. They'll feel very fluid. The attending is going to want to listen to you because it feels like your story is actually going to be helpful versus somebody who's just like listing facts. They can look up the labs of a patient, right? So that's not really helpful. They can look up they can literally read your H&P as you talk. That's not super helpful. So if you work backwards of trying to sell a story of like, this is why I think it's this and not why I think it's A, B, and C, you can get better at your presentations. So use that as kind of a framework. And then every day, asking your residents of saying, how was that presentation? What would you have included? What would you have not included? And just taking the feedback always with the mindset to improve. Because you'll definitely talk about things. There's stuff I talk about now as I'm approaching 3rd year residency that I realize in hindsight, that was totally useless information. But you get better at it over time. So having that backwards mindset of presenting is how I would do it. Also, just making sure you keep eye contact with who you're presenting with versus like trying to look at your notes. Maybe have your notes in like a bullet point structure in the way you would want to present it. That's how I did it in medical school. I would be like, here is the brief things on the HPI I want to talk about. Here are the brief things in the social history from the labs, and then you just keep moving forward. So work backwards, use bullet points to refer, keep eye contact with the person you're talking to, because it's really hard not to pay attention to somebody that's looking at you. So just don't be awkward, but that is one thing that I would say you could do. So hopefully that helps. All right. Ooh, okay. Recommendations for shy students who are starting medical school. it's okay to be shy. I think I considered myself to be more shy than not. I know I seem very outgoing on YouTube because you just kind of have to be. But if you put me in an environment with 4 other physicians, I would be the last person to talk. And there is a little bit of practice that goes into being okay speaking up. And so if you're somebody who answers every other question, or like, let's just say you speak up once a week when you're asked something from your like mentor and like you're in a big group setting, challenge yourself that saying, tomorrow I'm just going to say the answer without worrying about the consequences of feeling wrong. And ideally get better at this. I don't think I got better at this until I was a fourth year medical student. So being shy is not a hindrance. It's more of a challenge because you're going to have to be confident in your ability to help patients. And being shy is completely fine, but you can still be shy and confident. And so really you're asking, how can you develop that confidence despite being shy? And that just comes with a practice of saying, I'm okay with speaking up over time. And if you're wrong, realize that the consequences of being wrong is not very high when you're a medical student. So it's okay of saying something and saying, oh, that was actually not correct. Now I know. And 2, I realize that it's not a big deal speaking up, and you get better at it over time. Habit's asking, how would you review PQ questions, understand what you got wrong? Oh, practice questions. So we talked about this a little bit, understand what you got wrong. I would definitely say, just to review what I talked about earlier, is to, before you kind of look at the explanation, think about like what you thought you were answering and why you thought the answer you put ultimately was correct. And then usually use the explanations as a quick reference of saying, oh, this is where I missed the mark, or I was completely off here, or actually this is reversed from what I thought. So having that framework of what you thought the question was going to be, what you thought the explanation was going to be, and then quickly looking at the explanation of saying, here are the bits that I missed. Let me have a frame of reference, an Excel sheet, an Anki card, or something that I can quickly use in the future to refer back to this. That's how I would do that. Did you follow any high yield information containing books for each subject? Give or take. I think if it's for step 1, then I basically use UWorld first aid. But if it's for classes, then BRS does a great job. Now that there's more and more companies that make, med school resources, Picmonic does a good job, Physio does a good job. Online MedEd is starting to release more and more information for early med students. So I would definitely consider, if videos are your thing, to check out the companies that make the videos, because usually will have associated text with it. Usually when I find that people are going for books to answer their questions, they're not only trying to read their syllabus, now they're trying to read a high yield resource, and it just starts to like compound on itself on how much time you're using. So that's why I like using videos, and most of the videos are pretty short. So even if it's simple as saying, I'm just going to watch a YouTube channel or a YouTube video and then find channels that I keep coming back to for like this specific topic, that's completely okay. But I use BRS for things like physiology and really enjoyed it. But then on anatomy, I use like Anatomy Zone. So a lot of these are free resources. But it will come with practice. What are the best resources to build clinical knowledge and good understanding of the material? So I guess it depends on if you're talking about rotations and like actual like day-to-day clinical knowledge. I think from a broad spectrum look, Online Meta does a really good job of like talking about really every topic and kind of understanding broadly what to do. In terms of apps, things that I literally did this morning are things like Human DX. I'm not sure if it'll show up, but let's see. In case you guys aren't familiar, like with podcasts, like the Clinical Problem Solvers, it's great on your drives. If this thing will load. But basically what Human DX is that it's a free app. You can create it. And so let me see if that shows up. But it'll give you a vignette, and it'll tell you kind of their main problem, and it'll give you a story, and then you can kind of put your guesses. So if you think that this person with dyspnea, 46-year-old, had cancer, you would put that in your diagnosis, and then every time it gives you a little new bit of information, saying like, oh, here is their vitals, and then you can use that information to like add to your diagnosis. So that's a good way of just like having real life examples to answer your questions. So I love using Human DX. Clinical Problem Solvers is a great way to like use a podcast on my drive into work. I like reading the New England Journal of Medicine. There's usually like a copy that sits here on my desk, and I usually just review the review article because it helps me like understand the new stuff that's going on. While still being good at the old stuff. So hopefully that answers that. you guys are enjoying this live stream. I appreciate it. If you guys are, remember, just hit that like button. Just supports the channel. Also tells me that you guys want more live streams in the future, because I haven't done one of these in quite some time, mainly because of time constraints. But I will have a whole month where I will be home more often than I have in the past. So I'm going to use that to make more content for the YouTube channel, more for the MetaLead Academy. And obviously we can do more live streams if you guys like it. There have been some amazing questions so far. I really didn't expect all these. So I really appreciate you guys coming, just dropping your questions and going from there. I'll probably will go until 1, so I'll answer a few more questions. Let's see. I'm going to med school this year. Congratulations, Pooja. But I'm nervous. Please tell me about med school life. I answered this question a little bit earlier. 1, it's okay to be nervous. 2, understand that there is going to be a part of you that will have a certain expectation of what you have to do, what you have to give up. And that is going to really be kind of the start of your medical school experience. So what I mean by that is, when I started medical school, somebody asked me what I wanted out of those 4 years. And I said, I wanted those 4 years to be memorable and not just a stepping stone to residency, to fellowship, to a future career. And if you go with that mindset, not saying it's the right mindset, but when I use that mindset, every up and down in med school was simply what it should be, an up and down. But I still, in the background, was enjoying myself, working out, hanging out with now my wife, and working on side projects like TheMDJourney. But those are all things that are important to me. And still being okay with the ups and downs of like a test not going well. That is going to happen just because, 1, the information is extensive. You will require time to learn it. And sometimes the first time will not be the right time. And being okay with that. 2, you will feel like you have to sacrifice everything to do well, and that's not the answer. If anything, more time. And I'm sure a lot of you guys, let me know, like, just put a thumbs up or something if you fall into this. If you've told yourself that you needed to spend more time doing it, and then you realize that extra time really didn't help you. If that's you, go ahead and say, like, yes, been there, because I have. And if you think more time is the answer to your struggles, the answer is probably not. So it's okay to be nervous. It's important to be nervous, because that just means that you are aware that this is going to be a hard challenge. But just walk in with it and saying, I am not going to give up A, B, and C in my life. I'm not going to give up working out if that's important. I'm not going to give up my significant other if there's one, or your family. I'm not going to give up my favorite show on Thursdays or that come out. For me, it was The Flash. I don't know if you guys watched The Flash. It's like not a great show, but I watched it for so many years that I just needed to watch it when it came out. And also when LeBron played, because I'm a huge basketball fan. And those are my absolute, I can't miss. Those last 2 seem ridiculous, but I was happy in medical school because those things were still part of my life. So I could be nervous about all the tests and information, and you get better at saying over time, okay, yes, every class, every new material, every new rotation is going to feel odd. It's going to feel strange, but you just get okay with feeling that strangeness. But again, the back part of your life, the things that matter the most, are still there. So that's how I would attack that. So if you're nervous, that's totally fine. Just take the challenge, enjoy the experience, and whatever you don't want to give up, don't give it up. All right, let's see. How are medical journals useful in medical school? Probably not very much. I like to use review articles, but honestly, I would just if you're trying to use class material and then you're trying to use medical journals on top of it, I wouldn't. Just learn the knowledge the first time around. And you can use medical journals when you're in rotations to help better understand what's going on with your patients. Or when you're in my shoes and actually practicing as a physician, no one's testing you on things. You're I don't know what this is, Ewing sarcoma, which I don't really take care of as much, but make sure that I know that topic so I can read about it. All right. Is a high step 1 score really a validator of your ability as a physician? Absolutely not. I think your validation of, or your determinator of how good of a physician you'll be, is how over time you get at using less amount of time to learn something that's complex and broad. So what I mean by that is step 1 knowledge is very kind of detail oriented for things that honestly I just don't care about anymore as a physician, because it doesn't really help me day to day taking care of my patients. What does, it's saying, last time I took care of a patient with this, I struggled on knowing how long I should take care of them, or what antibiotic I should have given them, or how long, or what kind of vitals and labs I should have looked at. But now, because I've gotten better at pattern recognition, the first time wasn't the best experience to take care of them. The patients did well. I learned through not my shortfalls, but just my delay in giving them the adequate care. And so now when I have a patient with the same diagnosis, I already know A, B, and C, what to do. And then still with that patient, there are going to be things I still forget. Maybe I'm taking care of a DKA patient and I know I need to give them a ton of fluid because somebody told me to give them a ton of fluid, and that's what you should do. But I forgot their potassium. Think about the potassium. So the second time, if I still forget the potassium, third time, my first thing is going to be make sure the potassium's okay. So getting better at pattern recognition, getting better at pattern recognition. All this talking is definitely making my mouth dry. This meal is not helping. But getting better at pattern recognition is really what I think makes an amazing physician, because one, you become super humble to the fact that you won't know everything the first time. You won't do everything correct the first time. But if you're constantly looking for ways of where your shortfalls were, not as a criticism to yourself, but as an opportunity to improve, that's really where I find that the physicians that I worked with are just amazing. There's people that I've worked with or have been physicians for 40, 50, 60 years, and they're still always saying, oh, I don't really know that really well. I'm going to go read up on that. That's a doctor. That's like a doctor that's, been doing this 3 times longer than I've been alive. And they're still humble with the fact that there's parts of the information that they don't know, and they're going to fill those gaps in. So that's what I would say about that. I really don't want to give up sleep. You don't have to. There are going to be some days where you're going to have to study late into nights because you wanted to prepare for the test, and there are certain things that you still have left to review. That's okay. But for me, sleep was important. Those were kind of one of those like 3 things that I cared for. So although I enjoyed waking up really early into the day, I personally didn't want to work into the very late parts of the night. I hated that feeling of saying, oh, I'm going to get home, I'm going to study until like 10 o'clock, I'm going to go to bed, and then repeat. So instead, I would say I finished at 7 or 8:30 at night, and I'm going to spend 8:30 to 10 enjoying myself, watching TV, watching Netflix, watching YouTube, and then going to bed, because I felt like there's a part of me that still got to enjoy the parts of life that matter to me. So you don't have to give up on sleep. There are going to be some days where you're going to be sleep deprived just because you have a lot of things going on, but as long as sleep deprivation is not your normal, it's okay. What is your diet and health? How will you be? So my diet, I'm a vegetarian. Diet's plus or minus now, when you're in a residency, depending on how well your residency feeds you. Mine feeds me really well, so I take up opportunity on that, but then I come home saying I shouldn't have ate that. But I do work out a lot. So yesterday I went for a 4-mile run. Today I'll probably do something similar. And so I think right now I have the benefit of age, a good workout routine. And then also I tend to not eat breakfast just because I like to keep my calories for the other big meals and snacking that I do the rest of the day. Electives in medical school. So most electives I think are kind of fit into your 3rd, 4th year of medical school. And I would use those as an opportunity to, one, kind of, if you know what you're going to do for sure, find things that are kind of correlatory. So for example, if you're going to do anesthesia, do a pain management or a PM&R rotation, because there are some very similarities of what you may be doing in the future as an anesthesiologist that PM&R physicians do as well. Or if you're going to go into ER, do an ultrasound rotation, because that would be a great kind of correlative of something that you get to do. If you have a medical Spanish elective and you're going to do residency ultimately in a place, or do your practice ultimately in a place that has a very big Hispanic population, that would be great. So that's how I would use electives, either to explore an interest, or if you know the interest, then use things and saying, what skills would I love to have a year from now when I'm actually doing this for future. Ekta says, med school in July. Any advice for first year? What kinds of things should I get involved in right away? Research organization, study advice, time management tips. Cool. So I would slow down on the initial parts to get involved right away. This is not kind of like your college CV building opportunity. I would use your first semester for sure, of just saying, my first semester is all about figuring out how to study and how to manage my life in a busy medical school day. So I didn't do any research until like my second semester, first year, or even like remotely get involved into it. Because if you're trying to do all these things and you figure out your studying still not working, it's a recipe to stress yourself out. So use the first semester to really figure out your studying. And in terms of advice, there's lots of videos that I have on YouTube, and to avoid making this kind of live stream longer than it is. But what I would say is, and kind of a tip that I gave early on the live stream, is saying, what would you do differently if the test was tomorrow? And that really will force you to say, these are the techniques I love using and that are most effective for me. And this is what I need to double down on. And then constantly keep evaluating that answer, because you may find that this technique is no longer as useful as you thought it was when you're in college compared to when you are now. So maybe flashcards are the answer now where they weren't in med school, or vice versa. Maybe you just really enjoy writing on a whiteboard and that helps you answer the questions. And then time management tips. Really like have a visual representation of what your week will look like, when your classes will be, and then when your non-negotiable time will be. So before I actually schedule in my studying, I will have certain times scheduled in for when I'm working out during that week, when I'll be watching my favorite TV shows, and I'll be hanging out with then my fiance and now my wife. And that way it didn't feel guilty when I was spending an hour watching a TV show, because that was time that was already scheduled. Then you get really efficient on, back to your initial question of how to get better at studying. If you have one less hour to do it, you have to spend that one less hour being efficient and not wasting it. And so those are time management tips that I would give. But lots of other videos on the channel over the last 5-6 years that we've made now. So hopefully this helped you out. But congrats on getting into med school. Hopefully it starts off on a good note. All right, last few questions. Tilly says, first year med school in UK, exam in 2 months. I'm a bit anxious that I'm not preparing well. So for your first exams, you want to go into it with a sense of confidence. And so let's say, the test is in 4 weeks. I know your exam's in 2 months, but essentially what you want to do is over time, as you are going through your class material, as you're going through practice questions or whatever you're using to study, you want to create a list of what knowledge you're expected to know, or you think you're expected to know for the final thing. So let's say you have your test in 2 months and you start to accumulate this list of 500 topics you need to know. That's overwhelming. But you know that if you knew those 500 topics, you would do really well in the exam, right? So essentially what you would do is every single day have some form of review. Again, practice questions, whiteboards, group studying, writing it out, pick your technique of choice and saying, I'm going to work 30 minutes on this list. And you don't have to say I'm going to do 5 things. I'm just going to work 30 minutes. And cross things out off your list as they become more of a confidence booster. As you get closer to test day, again, your goal is to knock that list down until everything has been seen a few times and everything feels like it's a little bit natural. Not everything is going to feel like a strength, but at least not everything will feel like a weakness. So then when you go into test day, you're like, I know all of these topics to some extent. And ideally, you'll go into test day saying that I shouldn't get tripped up because I've seen all of this. Then you can evaluate based off of how the exam goes and saying, okay, I thought I did well on this topic, but I really didn't understand it as well. And then you can use it as kind of self-correction for exam number 2. But if you have a test in 2 months and you're really stressed out, just create a list as you go through your class material, as you go through your lectures, as you go through your notes of what type of things you should know, and then having time in your day or in your week to review that list and then just build that confidence over time. So 500 topics over the span of 2 months is overwhelming, but it'll be 495 after day 1 and 490. And eventually as you get close to test day, it'll be something that I've seen everything on this list. And these things aren't so bad. These things will definitely give me trouble. So let me spend more time reviewing this again. That's kind of how I would do it. All right. How will you refresh between your studying time and getting back to studying? Refresh. So I love working out. I love listening to podcasts. I love listening to books. So 2 of my favorite apps that I currently use is I love using Kindle Unlimited to read Scribed, in case you guys haven't heard talk about that on my email list. If you aren't, you guys can subscribe down below. But it's like $9.99 and you get audiobooks, you get podcasts, you get eBooks. So I can listen to those at 2x. And so I use those to just listen about things that I just don't get to learn about in medicine. And then I just live listening to Google Podcasts. So going for runs are really nice too, because then I can listen to one of those podcasts or just jam out to Drake, which is what I did yesterday. So I'm not sure who y'all's favorite artists are, but just those are the small things that I would do to refresh. And then I have my computer or my TV back there. So every so often I'll just turn a game on of NBA 2K, and that's usually how I'll spend my time. But yeah, that was awesome. There's a lot more questions than I thought there would be for this first live stream in quite some time. But I'm going to end it here, guys. If you guys did enjoy it and you're still watching, go ahead and hit that like button. And hopefully we can do another live stream in the future. And if you haven't done so already, go ahead and subscribe, because that way you'll know next time we do a live session. But I appreciate the love, appreciate all the questions. Hopefully this was helpful. If it was, just let me know, and we can try to do this again in the next few weeks. But hopefully you guys have a great day. Happy Sunday, or whatever it is, wherever you are. But I'll talk to you guys in the future. See y'all later.